The morning sun had barely peeked through the windows of Logan International Airport when flight attendant Maria Lopez walked through the quiet terminal, her navy blue uniform crisp and neat despite the early hour. After 15 years with United Airways, she could navigate these halls with her eyes closed, greeting the familiar faces of security guards and coffee shop workers who had become part of her daily routine. Today felt different, though. There was a new addition to her crew, a fresh-faced flight attendant named David Kim, straight out of training. She could see the nervous energy radiating from him as he double-checked his tie in the crew room mirror, adjusting it for what must have been the 10th time that morning. "First day jitters?" Maria asked warmly, remembering her own first flight all those years ago. She hadn't slept a wink the night before, worried about everything from beverage service to emergency procedures. David's reflection caught her eye in the mirror, and he managed a shaky smile. "That obvious, huh?" He turned around, fidgeting with his name tag now. I don't want to mess anything up." Maria couldn't help but chuckle. "We all started somewhere. Just stick close to me today. Boston to Chicago is a nice route to learn on." She checked her watch, a habit ingrained after years of living by strict flight schedules. "Come on, let's do our pre-flight checks." The Boeing 737 waited for them at gate C-12, its massive frame gleaming under the morning light. As they boarded before the passengers, Maria walked David through their routine, checking emergency equipment, stocking supplies, and ensuring everything was in its proper place. She could see him slowly relaxing as they went through each task, his shoulders losing some of their tension. "Remember," Maria said as they prepared the beverage carts, "these passengers are just people heading somewhere. Some are going home, some are going to business meetings, and some are starting their vacations. Treat them like neighbors you're having over for dinner." The first passengers began boarding right on schedule. Maria watched as David greeted each one with growing confidence, his initial nervousness giving way to natural friendliness. A young mother with twins received extra attention as he helped her store her diaper bag. An elderly gentleman using a cane was assisted to his seat with care. Everything was running smoothly, almost too smoothly. In Maria's experience, that's usually when something unexpected was about to happen. As she did one final check of the first-class cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this routine flight might have some surprises in store. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their final preparations for takeoff. Maria caught David's eye and gave him an encouraging nod. He'd done well so far, but the real test would come once they were in the air. Little did either of them know that this ordinary Tuesday morning flight would soon become one they'd never forget. The plane pushed back from the gate, the gentle rumble of engines filling the cabin. As they taxied toward the runway, Maria took her position for the safety demonstration, watching David mirror her movements from the other end of the plane. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the aisle, and as the aircraft lifted into the sky, none of the passengers could have guessed they were about to become part of an extraordinary story that would touch hearts across the country. The flight had reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs finally clicked off. Maria could feel the familiar rhythm of lunch service approaching. She glanced at her watch. 11:30 a.m., right on schedule. The smell of warm meals wafted through the cabin as she and David began preparing the service cart in the galley. "Remember," she whispered to David, who was carefully arranging the soup bowls, "first-class passengers get served first. Take it slow and steady." She noticed his hands were slightly shaky as he organized the china. It reminded her of her own first lunch service years ago. The cart rolled smoothly down the aisle of first class, where business people typed on laptops and a few passengers dozed beneath thin airplane blankets. David followed behind Maria, learning the choreography of airline service, the way she remembered passenger preferences, how she anticipated their needs before they asked. In seat 2C sat Mr. Thompson, a distinguished-looking man in his late 70s, wearing a perfectly pressed charcoal suit. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he looked up from his book. Maria noticed he was reading a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She'd seen him on previous flights, always with a different classic novel in hand. "The soup today is tomato basil, sir," Maria said warmly, preparing to serve him. Just then, the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. Nothing serious, but enough to make David stumble slightly. He bumped into Maria's elbow just as she was lowering the soup bowl. Time seemed to slow down. Maria watched in horror as the hot soup tilted, then spilled, creating a bright red splash across Mr. Thompson's crisp white shirt and expensive suit. The liquid spread quickly, creating a growing stain that seemed to mock the perfect press of his clothing. The first-class cabin fell silent. A few passengers lowered their phones, already anticipating drama. Maria heard someone whisper, "Oh no," from a few rows back. David stood frozen, his face pale with shock. Mr. Thompson looked down at his ruined suit, then up at Maria and David. The moment stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Maria had seen situations like this go badly before. She'd witnessed passengers scream over much less than a ruined designer suit. She quickly grabbed napkins, her mind racing through company protocols for passenger incidents. "Sir, I am so incredibly sorry," she began, her heart pounding. David looked like he might faint, rooted to the spot, still holding onto the cart with white knuckles. A foam camera flashed from somewhere in the cabin. Another passenger had already pulled out their phone, probably expecting the kind of viral airplane meltdown that usually made the evening news. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Thompson's expression was unreadable as he dabbed at his suit with a napkin. Maria held her breath, waiting for the anger, the demands to speak to a supervisor, the threat of a lawsuit. All reactions she'd seen before in similar situations. But sometimes, life surprises you in the most unexpected ways. And what happened next would not only change the entire mood of that flight, but would eventually touch the hearts of millions of people across the country. Nobody in that first-class cabin could have predicted how this simple accident would unfold into something truly remarkable. The soup dripped steadily onto the floor, creating a small puddle by Mr. Thompson's expensive leather shoes. David had finally found his voice and was stammering apologies, while Maria continued offering napkins and solutions. But Mr. Thompson hadn't said a word yet, and his reaction in the next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would remind everyone on that flight about the power of human kindness. The tension in the first-class cabin could have been cut with a knife. Maria's hands were still full of napkins, and David looked like he might pass out at any moment. Everyone waited for Mr. Thompson's reaction, phones recording, expecting the worst. But what happened next left everyone speechless. Mr. Thompson looked down at his soup-soaked suit, then back up at the frightened flight attendants. And then, to everyone's amazement, he started to laugh. Not an angry laugh, but a genuine, warm chuckle that seemed to instantly break the tension in the cabin. "You know," he said, still smiling, "I've been teaching high school for 40 years, and I had everything from paint to chemistry experiments spilled on me. This isn't even in my top 10 clothing disasters." He grabbed a napkin and started dabbing at his suit, completely unfazed. The phones recording the scene didn't lower, but now they were capturing something entirely different from what their owners had expected. Instead of an angry confrontation, they were witnessing a moment of remarkable grace. David, who had been frozen in place, finally found his voice. "Sir, I'm so sorry. It was my fault. I bumped into her, and—" his voice cracked slightly with emotion. Mr. Thompson held up his hand, stopping David mid-sentence. "Young man, do you know what I tell my students on their first day of teaching?" He paused, making sure he had David's full attention. "I tell them that mistakes are just proof that you're trying. The only people who never make mistakes are the ones who never do anything at all." Maria watched in amazement as Mr. Thompson reached for his carry-on bag and pulled out a spare shirt. "After 40 years of teaching teenagers, you learn to come prepared," he explained with a wink. though I usually packed extra clothes for science experiment days, not soup accidents. Other passengers, who had been holding their breath waiting for drama, began to relax. A few even chuckled. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from tense to almost celebratory, as if everyone had just witnessed something rare and precious, which in fact they had. A passenger a few rows back called out, "Sir, you must have been an amazing teacher." Mr. Thompson's eyes twinkled as he responded, "Well, I had plenty of practice turning accidents into learning moments. You should have seen what happened the day we studied volcanoes." Maria quickly offered to help clean up, but Mr. Thompson waved her off. "Please," he said, "go take care of the other passengers. I've got this handled." He turned to David, who still looked shaken. "And you, young man, I hope you're taking notes. This is how you handle life's little surprises." The whole cabin seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The phones that had been recording slowly lowered, but not before capturing this beautiful moment of human understanding. Some passengers were already typing on their phones, no doubt sharing what they'd just witnessed. As Maria returned to serving the other passengers, she couldn't help but notice how the mood in the cabin had changed. People who had been absorbed in their laptops or phones were now chatting with their seatmates, sharing their own stories of times when kindness had turned a bad situation around. David, encouraged by Mr. Thompson's response, began to regain his confidence. The older man kept engaging him in conversation as he changed his shirt, asking about his training and sharing more stories from his teaching days. What could have been a disaster had somehow transformed into a moment of connection and learning. The incident had lasted barely 10 minutes, but its impact would reach far beyond that flight. Sometimes the most powerful lessons about humanity come when we least expect them, even at 35,000 feet in the air. As the flight continued towards Chicago, something remarkable began to happen in the first-class cabin. What started as a simple conversation between Mr. Thompson and the flight attendants had blossomed into something much more meaningful. During a quiet moment between services, Mr. Thompson motioned for Maria to sit in the empty seat next to him. "You remind me of one of my best students," he said, pulling out his wallet. Inside was a worn photograph of a classroom from the 1990s. She was nervous her first day of student teaching too, just like your young colleague. But by the end of the year, she was running that classroom like she'd been doing it her whole life. Maria found herself sharing stories about her own grandfather, who had also been a teacher back in Puerto Rico. He used to say that teaching was like flying. You're responsible for safely guiding people from one point to another, she said, smiling at the memory. David, who had been restocking supplies nearby, couldn't help but listen in. His earlier embarrassment had faded, replaced by genuine interest. Mr. Thompson noticed and waved him over during a quiet moment. "Come here, young man," he said warmly. "Let me tell you about the time I accidentally set off the fire sprinklers during a chemistry demonstration. Now that was a real mess. Had the whole science department underwater for a week." His eyes twinkled as he spoke, and several nearby passengers chuckled at the story. A businesswoman in the next row took off her headphones, drawn into the conversation. "My mother was a teacher too," she added. "She always said the best lessons come from the biggest mistakes." Soon, other passengers began sharing their own stories of memorable teachers who had impacted their lives. The first-class cabin had transformed from a quiet space of strangers into something that felt more like a cozy living room. People who had been absorbed in their devices were now fully engaged in conversation, sharing laughs and memories. One passenger mentioned she had already posted the soup incident video online, but not for the reason she'd originally intended. "People need to see this," she explained. "We're so used to seeing videos of people being awful to each other on planes. This is different. This is beautiful." Mr. Thompson used the moment to share more wisdom from his years in education. "You know," he said, looking around at everyone, "in 40 years of teaching, I learned that the most important lesson isn't in any textbook. It's how we treat each other when things go wrong." David, who had started the day terrified of making mistakes, was now standing taller, more confident. He shared how he almost quit during training, worried he wasn't cut out for the job. "I was so scared of messing up," he admitted. "But now I see that it's not about being perfect. It's about how you handle the imperfect moments." Maria watched all of this unfold with a sense of wonder. In her 15 years of flying, she'd never seen anything quite like it. A simple accident that could have turned ugly had instead created a moment of genuine human connection. The cabin crew supervisor, who had heard about the incident, came to check on the situation. Instead of finding a complaint in progress, she discovered passengers engaged in animated conversation, sharing stories and laughter. Mr. Thompson had turned what could have been a crisis into an impromptu lesson of grace and understanding. As they began their descent into Chicago, the mood in the cabin was unlike any typical flight. Passengers who would normally be impatiently checking their watches or gathering their belongings were still engaged in conversation, reluctant to see this unusual flight come to an end. But this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. What happened in that first-class cabin was about to reach far beyond the confines of the aircraft, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted. The magic of what happened on that flight didn't stay contained within the airplane's walls for long. By the time the plane touched down in Chicago, the video of Mr. Thompson's reaction to the soup incident had already started making waves online. A tech-savvy passenger had posted it with the caption, "Watch what happens when a flight attendant spills soup on this retired teacher, not what you'd expect." The responses started pouring in almost immediately. Within hours, the video had thousands of shares, with comments flooding in from around the world. "This made me cry happy tears," wrote one viewer. "My dad was a teacher for 35 years, and this is exactly how he would have handled it." Another commented, "This is the kind of content we need to see more of. Real people showing real kindness." As passengers disembarked at O'Hare International Airport, something unusual happened. Instead of the typical rush to leave, people lingered, exchanging contact information and taking photos with Mr. Thompson. One passenger even suggested creating a group chat to stay in touch, something unheard of among strangers on a flight. The airline's social media team spotted the trending video and reached out to their flight crew for details. Maria and David found themselves sharing the story with their supervisor, who was moved by how the situation had unfolded. "In all my years with the airline," the supervisor said, "I've never seen a passenger complaint turn into something so positive." Mr. Thompson insisted on staying behind to speak with the flight crew before heading to his connection. "You know," he said, adjusting his new shirt, the soup-stained one carefully packed away, "in my classroom, I always told my students that character isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about how you handle them when they happen." David, who had started the day feeling like he'd never make it as a flight attendant, was now standing tall beside Maria. The nervous rookie from the morning had been replaced by someone who'd learned an invaluable lesson about grace under pressure. A local news crew, having caught wind of the viral video, was already waiting at the gate. They asked Mr. Thompson what made him respond with such kindness. His answer was simple but profound. "When you spend 40 years teaching teenagers, you learn that there's no point in crying over spilled soup, or in this case, spilled tomato basil." The story continued to spread throughout the day. Teachers shared it in their break rooms, flight attendants passed it around in their crew groups, and motivational speakers bookmarked it for future reference. But what touched people most wasn't just Mr. Thompson's reaction. It was how one moment of kindness had created a ripple effect throughout the entire cabin. Maria received messages from crew members worldwide, asking her to share more details about what happened. The amazing thing, she told them, wasn't just how he handled the spill. It was how he turned it into a moment that brought everyone together. By evening, the video had caught the attention of several national news networks. But what made this story different from typical viral videos was its authenticity. There was no drama, no conflict, just pure human kindness captured in its most natural form. The airline's corporate office took notice too. They saw something special in this story, a genuine moment that represented the best of human nature at 35,000 feet. What they decided to do next would turn this heartwarming incident into something even more meaningful. The airline's corporate office didn't waste any time. By the next morning, they had a plan that would transform this viral moment into something even more meaningful. The CEO herself had watched the video and made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. "We want to do more than just acknowledge this moment," she announced in an emergency staff meeting. "We want to build on it." Within hours, the airline's marketing team had reached out to Mr. Thompson with an extraordinary proposal. But Mr. Thompson had his own ideas. When the airline offered him free first-class flights for a year, he had an unexpected response. "That's very kind," he said during the video call, "but I have a better idea. Why don't we use this opportunity to help future teachers?" He suggested creating a scholarship fund for students studying to become teachers, particularly those who wanted to work in underserved communities. The airline executives exchanged looks of surprise and admiration. This was so much better than their original plan. Meanwhile, David had become something of a celebrity among the airline's training staff. New flight attendants were now being shown the video as part of their training. "See," their instructors would say, "this is how we turn difficult moments into opportunities for connection." The story took another surprising turn when teachers across the country began sharing their own classroom disaster stories online, inspired by Mr. Thompson's grace. One teacher wrote about a student accidentally setting off the fire alarm during a presentation, and how they turned it into a lesson about staying calm under pressure. Another shared about a failed science experiment that ended up teaching more about resilience than chemistry. Maria found herself invited to speak at flight attendant training sessions. The real lesson, she would tell the trainees, isn't about how to avoid spilling soup. It's about how to handle yourself when things don't go as planned. The airline's customer service department noticed something interesting in the weeks following the incident. Their complaint numbers had dropped. It seemed that both staff and passengers were inspired to handle difficult situations with more patience and understanding. Local news stations picked up the story of the scholarship fund. During one interview, Mr. Thompson explained his philosophy. Teaching isn't just about sharing knowledge. It's about showing others how to navigate life's messy moments with dignity. The incident even caught the attention of education conferences. Mr. Thompson received invitations to speak about how teachers can model grace under pressure. His message was simple but powerful. Every mistake is an opportunity to teach something more valuable than any lesson plan. David, who had been so terrified of making mistakes during his training, wrote a blog post about his experience that went viral in its own right. "I thought I had ruined my career before it even started," he wrote. "Instead, I learned the most important lesson of all: how to turn a moment of panic into a moment of growth." The airline decided to take things a step further. They announced a new company-wide initiative called Teaching Kindness at 30,000 feet. The program would recognize crew members who handled challenging situations with exceptional grace and understanding. As the story continued to spread, it sparked conversations about kindness in unexpected places: corporate boardrooms, school staff meetings, and even other airlines. People began to realize that sometimes the most powerful teaching moments happen outside the classroom. Social media had a field day with the story, but not in the way most viral airplane videos usually trend. Instead of angry comments and arguments, the comment sections were filled with people sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness. The original video had now reached over 10 million views, with translations appearing in dozens of languages. One morning, a middle school teacher in Texas showed the video to her class during a lesson about kindness. The students were so moved that they started their own kindness campaign, inspired by what they saw. They wrote letters to Mr. Thompson, sharing how his story had influenced them. "Dear Mr. Thompson," one student wrote, "yesterday I spilled my lunch in the cafeteria. Everyone was waiting for me to cry, but I remembered your story and laughed instead. Then something amazing happened. Other kids helped me clean up instead of making fun of me. The video's impact reached beyond schools and airlines. Business consultants started using it in their corporate training sessions. Look at how this situation was handled, they would say. No policies were quoted, no managers were called. Just simple human kindness turned a potential crisis into a moment of connection. David's personal story particularly resonated with people struggling with perfectionism and fear of failure. He started receiving messages from people worldwide. I was so afraid of making mistakes at my new job, but your story helped me realize that it's not about being perfect. It's about how we handle our imperfections. Maria noticed changes in her daily flights too. Passengers who recognized her from the video would share their own stories. One businessman told her how the video had changed his approach to managing his team. I used to get angry at every little mistake. Now I ask myself, what would Mr. Thompson do? The airline's new kindness initiative was making waves in the industry. Other airlines took notice, and soon similar programs started popping up across the aviation world. Flight attendants began sharing their own stories of turning difficult moments into opportunities for connection. Local news caught up with some of the passengers from that original flight. The businesswoman who had been wearing headphones shared how the experience changed her. I used to spend every flight isolated in my own world. Now I make a point to really see the people around me. Parents started using the story to teach their children about handling accidents. One mother shared online, "My 5-year-old spilled juice all over our new carpet. Before I could react, she looked at me and said, 'Remember the airplane teacher, Mommy? Sometimes we spill things, and that's okay.'" The story even made its way into a popular psychology magazine, which did a feature on the power of responding to accidents with grace. They interviewed experts who explained how Mr. Thompson's reaction wasn't just kind. It was also a masterclass in emotional intelligence. Teacher training programs began incorporating the incident into their curriculum, using it as an example of how educators can turn mishaps into teaching moments. One professor noted, "We can teach classroom management techniques all day, but this single incident demonstrates something more valuable: the power of human connection." A children's book author was so inspired that she wrote a picture book about the incident, titled "The Day Teacher Thompson Flew." The book simplified the story for young readers while maintaining its powerful message about kindness and understanding. 6 months after the famous soup incident, the airline organized a special event that brought together everyone involved in the story. The company's main training center was transformed into a celebration of kindness, with a viral video playing on screens throughout the building. Mr. Thompson arrived early, wearing a brand new suit, though he joked that he kept a spare one in his briefcase, just in case. He was surprised to find a room full of flight attendants in training, all eager to hear him speak. But what touched him most was seeing Maria and David standing proudly at the front of the room. "You know," Mr. Thompson began, adjusting his glasses, "I've given thousands of lessons in my teaching career, but the most important one happened because of spilled soup on an airplane." The room filled with warm laughter. Sometimes life's best teachings come dressed as accidents. The airline had prepared something special. They revealed that they'd created a new training module called the Thompson Approach, focusing on turning difficult moments into opportunities for human connection. But that wasn't all. The scholarship fund they'd established had already helped 5 students start their teaching careers. One of these scholarship recipients was present at the event. A young student teacher stood up and shared how the viral video had confirmed her choice to become an educator. "I was having doubts about teaching," she admitted. "But seeing how a simple moment of kindness could touch so many lives, that's exactly why I want to teach." David, no longer the nervous rookie, gave a speech about how that day changed his approach to his job. "I thought I had to be perfect," he said, his voice confident now. "But Mr. Thompson taught me that it's our imperfect moments that give us the chance to show our true character." The event took an unexpected turn when passengers from the original flight began arriving. They'd been secretly invited by the airline. The businesswoman who had first posted the video online hugged Mr. Thompson, telling him how her video had received thousands of positive comments in dozens of languages. Maria shared something surprising too. She'd been keeping track of how many passengers mentioned the soup story during her flights. In 6 months, she revealed, not a single day has gone by without at least one person bringing it up. And every time they do, they're smiling. The airline's CEO announced that they were expanding their kindness initiative. They would now offer special recognition to crew members who handled difficult situations with exceptional grace. The award would be called the Thompson Spirit Award, complete with a small soup ladle pin as a humorous touch. During the lunch break, soup was notably absent from the menu. People gathered in small groups, sharing their own stories of how the video had influenced them. A pilot mentioned how he now starts every flight by telling his crew, "Remember the soup story. Anything can become a moment of connection." Teachers who had been invited to the event traded stories about how they'd used the video in their classrooms. One elementary school teacher shared how her students had started a kindness journal, writing down moments when they turned accidents into opportunities for friendship. The local news crew who had covered the original story was back, but this time they noticed something different. 6 months ago, we thought we were covering a cute viral moment, the reporter said. Now we realize we're covering a movement. As the event wound down, Mr. Thompson stood near the exit, shaking hands and sharing smiles. One of the flight attendant trainees asked him if he ever imagined a bowl of soup could change so many lives. He chuckled and replied, "In 40 years of teaching, I learned that the best lessons often come from the most unexpected moments." 1 year after the soup incident, it was clear that this wasn't just a viral moment. It had become a lasting movement. The airline's training center had a wall dedicated to what they now called the soup story, featuring photos, news clippings, and letters from people around the world. Mr. Thompson still flew regularly, though now passengers would often recognize him. "Are you the soup teacher?" they'd ask with bright smiles. He always took time to chat with them, especially if they were nervous flyers or traveling with children. Sometimes he'd even pull out his worn copy of whatever book he was reading and share a story or two. David had blossomed into one of the airline's most requested flight attendants. The nervous rookie who once feared making mistakes now trained new staff members. When things go wrong, he would tell them, "Remember that you're not just handling a situation. You're creating a memory that passengers will carry with them." Maria kept in touch with Mr. Thompson, meeting him for coffee whenever their schedules aligned. They'd laugh about how a simple bowl of soup had changed their lives. "You know what's funny?" she said during one of these meetings. "I must have served thousands of bowls of soup in my career, but the one I spilled turned out to be the most important." The airline's scholarship program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple fund now supported dozens of future teachers. Each scholarship recipient received a special letter from Mr. Thompson, reminding them that their biggest teaching moments might come from their biggest mistakes. The children's book inspired by the incident, The Day Teacher Thompson Flew, had become a favorite in elementary schools. Teachers used it to start conversations about kindness, grace, and how to handle life's little accidents. One school even started a tradition of reading it on the first day of class each year. The impact reached far beyond education and aviation. Companies began using the story in their customer service training. "Look for the Thompson moment," they would say, referring to those opportunities to turn a problem into a connection. Some even kept a spare suit in their offices, jokingly calling it their Thompson backup plan. On social media, people started sharing their own soup stories, moments when kindness transformed what could have been a negative experience. A coffee shop posted about a customer who responded with laughter when their drink was made wrong. A library shared about a visitor who helped clean up when someone knocked over a book display. Mr. Thompson's former students organized a reunion, bringing together 4 decades of learners whose lives he had touched. They shared stories of his classroom wisdom, but the soup incident had given them a new appreciation for the lessons he had taught them about grace and understanding. The airline created a special ceremony for retiring crew members, where they would share their own soup stories, moments when they chose kindness over confrontation. These stories became part of the airline's legacy, passed down to each new generation of flight attendants. As for the original soup-stained suit, Mr. Thompson donated it to the airline's museum, where it hung in a display case with a simple plaque. Sometimes the best lessons come from life's little spills. Next to it was a guest book filled with messages from visitors sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness. 1 year later, the video was still being shared, but now it came with thousands of comments from people describing how it had changed their approach to life's little accidents. "I used to get so angry about small mistakes," one comment read. "Now I ask myself, what would Mr. Thompson do?"